There is a version of this story where everything goes right, where the system is built around the best player, where the officials blow the whistle when she gets hit, where her teammates finish the shots she creates for them, where the organization protects her instead of quietly working around her. That version of this story does not exist in Indiana right now, and yet, somehow, Caitlin Clark keeps winning anyway. What happened in the Connecticut Sun game was not just a basketball game. It was a complete and unfiltered exposure of every single force working against Clark right now. The officiating, the offensive system, the execution failures around her, and a simultaneous demonstration that none of it is enough to stop her. Not even close. Because when the final buzzer sounded, Indiana had a win. Caitlin had another masterclass performance on the stat sheet, and the people who built the system designed to limit her were standing on the sideline watching her carry them anyway. This is the story of that game, and it goes much deeper than the final score. There is one moment from the fourth quarter of this game that every single person watching needs to understand before anything else gets discussed, because it did not just affect the outcome of one possession, it represents something much larger that has been building all season long, and it finally became impossible to ignore. Brittney Griner, one of the most physically imposing players in the history of this league, a player whose size and strength alone make her one of the most dangerous physical presences on any court she steps onto, delivered a collision against Caitlin Clark in the fourth quarter of this game that by any honest standard of officiating consistency should have produced a whistle. Not a judgment call, not a borderline situation where reasonable people could disagree, a physical interaction that applied to any other player in a comparable situation anywhere else in this game results in a foul call. Automatic. No discussion. The officials did not blow the whistle. Let that sit for a moment. Griner bulldozes Clark in the fourth quarter of a competitive game. Clark absorbs the contact. The play continues. No call. No consequence for the Connecticut player, no protection for the Indiana player. The game just moves on as if nothing happened, as if a player the size and strength of Brittney Griner did not just physically overwhelm one of the most important offensive players in the league without a single official seeing fit to intervene. Clark was visibly frustrated after the play, and if you watched it in real time, that frustration made complete and total sense. Because this was not the first time, it was not the second, it was not even close to an isolated incident that could be filed away as one of those things that happens in competitive basketball. It was another entry in a season-long record of officiating decisions surrounding Clark that, when you look at them together, tell a story that the numbers make impossible to dismiss. Here is the number that tells you everything you need to know about the officiating picture in this game. Caitlin Clark, a player who attacks the basket with the kind of aggressive directness that elite offensive players use specifically to generate contact and draw fouls, did not shoot a single free throw in this game. 0. Not one. For an entire game. A player producing at the individual level Clark has been producing at, running at defenders, creating contact situations, driving into the paint, and the officials found 0 situations across 40 minutes of basketball where she deserved a trip to the free throw line? That is not a coincidence. That is not bad luck. That is a pattern. The analytical community has been tracking the officiating situation around Clark all season with increasing documentation and increasing frustration, and what the data shows is consistent and damning. Contact situations that produce whistles for other players in identical circumstances pass without calls when Clark is the one absorbing the contact. Moving screen violations that directly affect her movement and directly affect her ability to operate offensively are allowed to stand without correction. Defensive positioning that would be called illegal on other plays gets ignored when the player being impeded is Clark. The cumulative effect of all of this is not small. It is not something you can wave away as competitive variance or the normal randomness of officiating across a long season. It is a material competitive disadvantage that touches every single aspect of Clark's statistical output and limits the possessions her offensive capabilities should be generating. Every game she plays, she is doing it with one hand tied behind her back by an officiating standard that is simply not applied to her the way it is applied to everyone else. And even with all of that, she is still producing at an extraordinary level, which brings us to the numbers. Before this Connecticut game even started, Clark was already in the middle of one of the most analytically significant production stretches this entire season has generated. And understanding what those numbers represent is essential to understanding what her performance against the Sun actually means in context. Across the 5 most recent games entering this matchup, Clark produced 103 points, 37 assists, 27 rebounds, and 14 three-point makes. Indiana went 4-1 in those 5 games. Take a moment and actually absorb what those numbers are saying. 103 points across 5 games. 37 assists, a number that would be remarkable for a point guard playing in a system specifically designed to maximize her facilitation, let alone for a player operating in a motion offense that frequently routes possessions away from her direct involvement. 27 rebounds, 14 threes, 4 wins. Those are not the numbers of a player who is struggling. Those are not the numbers of a player who is being held back by the environment around her. Those are MVP caliber numbers, delivered consistently across a sustained stretch where the coaching decisions, the officiating, and the systemic constraints have all been simultaneously working against fully maximizing what she generates. There is an argument that has been circulating in certain corners of the basketball discourse that the Indiana Fever are actually better without Caitlin Clark, that the motion offense runs more smoothly when possessions are distributed more evenly, that the team chemistry improves when one player is not the focal point of everything. That argument exists. People have made it. And the 5-game statistical window Clark just produced does not merely challenge that argument, it does not simply raise questions about it. It demolishes it completely, without ambiguity, and leaves nothing standing. 103 points, 37 assists, 27 rebounds, 4 wins in 5 games. Clark is the difference between this Indiana team being a competitive force in the WNBA and being a middling roster with interesting pieces but no engine. The evidence is not complicated, the conclusion it supports is not in doubt, and anyone still making the better without Clark argument after looking at these numbers is either not looking at the numbers or is choosing to ignore what they say. Against Connecticut specifically, Clark added another performance to this stretch that, given the circumstances surrounding it, the motion offense limiting her direct creative involvement, the 0 free throws, the Griner hit going uncalled, belongs in a category that deserves more recognition than it typically receives. She was producing a masterclass under conditions specifically designed to make producing a masterclass difficult. That is not something that happens by accident. That is a player who is simply operating at a level that the obstacles around her cannot contain. Here is something that gets lost in the game-by-game discussion of Clark's individual performances. The Indiana Fever's offensive system is not designed to optimize Caitlin Clark. That is not speculation. That is not a hot take manufactured for engagement. It is a straightforward description of what the motion offense that this coaching staff deploys actually does and how it actually functions in practice. The motion offense is built around constant movement, ball rotation, and the creation of scoring opportunities through systematic passing sequences that cycle the ball through multiple players before a shot emerges. In theory, this system works for any roster because it does not depend on any individual player being the constant focal point of the offense. The ball moves, players rotate, shots come out of the movement. The problem, and it is a significant problem, is that Caitlin Clark is not any individual player. She is one of the most gifted offensive creators in the history of this league. Her ability to generate points and create shots not just for herself, but for teammates off her handle and her passing is extraordinary and documented across this entire season. A system that was designed to maximize her capabilities would put the ball in her hands more, create more off-ball movement around her, and let her direct the offense with the creative freedom her skill set deserves. The motion offense does the opposite. It routes possessions around her and through other players. It creates situations where Clark is one node in a passing sequence rather than the engine driving the entire offensive operation. And the result is that possessions frequently conclude for other players who are good but who are not Caitlin Clark, rather than for the player whose offensive capability is driving this team's competitive results. And yet, despite this system, despite a coaching philosophy that is not built to maximize what she does, despite playing in an offensive framework that a player of her caliber should have long since outgrown and demanded adjustment to, Clark is still producing 103 points, 37 assists, and 27 rebounds over 5 games. She is still carrying this team to wins. She is still the primary reason Indiana is competitive. What that tells you is not just that Clark is good. What it tells you is that Clark is operating at a level so far above the systemic constraints surrounding her that even a motion offense designed to distribute possessions away from her cannot prevent her from being the decisive factor in game after game. The mind genuinely wanders when it tries to calculate what she would generate in a system actually built around her abilities. The numbers she is producing now, under these conditions, are already extraordinary. Give her the creative freedom and the organizational framework her talent level demands, and the production conversation enters territory that becomes genuinely difficult to contextualize. But that system does not currently exist in Indiana, and so Clark continues to produce extraordinary numbers within constraints that should be limiting her far more than they are, and continues to drag this team to wins that the coaching decisions surrounding her would not have produced without her individual excellence. There is a dimension of Clark's impact on this Indiana team that the official statistical record consistently fails to capture, and it is directly connected to one of the most significant execution problems this game against Connecticut exposed. When Clark's playmaking creates an open interior look, when her passing, her handle, her ability to collapse a defense draws defenders toward her and opens up a high-percentage close-range opportunity for a teammate, and that teammate misses the shot, two things happen simultaneously. Clark does not get an assist, because assists are only recorded when the pass directly precedes a made basket. And the possession value that Clark created, the defensive advantage she generated through her offensive threat, is entirely wasted. This means Clark's actual impact on Indiana's offensive possessions is meaningfully higher than her official assist totals reflect. Every missed shot that follows a Clark pass that created the opportunity represents a possession where Clark did her job at an elite level, and the statistical credit for that work simply evaporated because the finish did not come. Aaliyah Boston's close-range conversion rate in pressure situations has been a documented concern across this season, and the Connecticut Sun game added another significant entry to that record. The missed bunnies, the short-range layup opportunities that Clark's playmaking created and delivered in situations where professional players at any level are expected to convert, were significant enough in this game to materially affect the competitive picture in ways that the final margin does not fully reveal. This is not about singling out one player for disproportionate criticism. Boston is a valuable piece of this Indiana roster, with real skills and real contributions to this team's competitive success. But when a pattern exists, when the same execution failure keeps appearing in the same types of situations across multiple games, honest analysis requires naming it and examining what it means for the team's ability to perform at its highest level. The basketball logic of the correction needed here is not complicated. Professional players at this level are expected to convert close-range looks that the offense creates for them. The motion offense generates interior opportunities. Clark's playmaking elevates the quality and frequency of those opportunities. When those opportunities consistently result in missed layups, particularly in fourth quarters and pressure situations when converting them matters most, the coaching staff has an obligation to address the pattern through individual accountability and focused practice repetition. The broader implication for Clark is this. Her actual value to this team's offensive operation is being systematically understated by a statistical framework that can only measure what results in made baskets. The passes that create open looks that don't get converted, the defensive pressure she attracts that opens up teammates who then miss the shot. None of that shows up in the box score. All of it represents real and significant value that Clark is generating and that the official record is failing to capture. Sophie Cunningham came back from her injury designation in this game and produced 11 points in 18 minutes on 4 of 5 from the field, including 3 of 4 from three-point range. By any competitive standard, that is efficient, meaningful production from a player returning from a physical issue. She came back, she contributed, she made big shots in the closing stretch of the game, and Indiana was better for having her on the floor. But the full story of Cunningham's return to this game cannot be told without acknowledging the organizational context that surrounded her absence, because that context makes the return more complicated and more interesting than a simple player comes back from injury and performs well narrative. Cunningham had been listed as questionable with an elbow injury. The timing of that designation and the circumstances surrounding when it appeared relative to other things happening within the organization generated significant commentary and speculation. Clark herself was heard telling the media that Cunningham had promised to make 3 threes and that she had been skeptical right up until the final 5 minutes when Cunningham delivered on exactly that promise. The observation that generated its own separate wave of commentary was this. Cunningham's performance on the floor looked indistinguishable from a fully healthy Sophie Cunningham. The elbow that had kept her listed as questionable did not appear to be limiting her movement, her shooting mechanics, her ability to play with her characteristic competitive energy, or any other observable physical aspect of her game. She played like someone who was ready to compete, not like someone who was managing a physical limitation. Now, what does that observation actually mean? There are multiple honest interpretations available. One is that Cunningham is simply a competitive professional athlete who plays through discomfort and performs at her level regardless of physical issues, which is something professional athletes do and which deserves respect rather than suspicion. Another is that the elbow situation was more complicated than a straightforward injury designation, and that the timing and context of the designation's appearance relative to the organizational circumstances surrounding it reflect something about the internal environment of this team that has not been fully and publicly explained. What everyone agrees on is that Cunningham made shots, Indiana won, and her performance in the closing stretch was one of the real competitive contributions to the final result. The rest of it, what the injury designation reflects, what the organizational situation around her absence actually was, remains in the territory of things that the full available context makes impossible to evaluate purely on medical merits alone. In the post-game media session, a reporter raised something directly that had been circulating in the background of discussions about this Indiana team for weeks. The question was about team division. Specifically, reports or speculation suggesting that there is a fracture within the Indiana Fever roster, a split between different factions of players, a dynamic that goes beyond the normal competitive tension of a team navigating a difficult season. The reporter framed it carefully, acknowledging that the on-court evidence, a win, good performances from multiple players, Clark and Cunningham apparently working effectively together in the closing stretch, seemed to tell a different story than the division narrative would suggest. But they asked anyway, because the question was out there and deserved a direct response. Clark's answer was measured, precise, and more pointed than it might initially appear. She did not deny that something was being discussed. She did not dismiss the question as baseless or wave it away with a "we're just focused on basketball" deflection. What she said was that she did not think the things being circulated constituted reports in any legitimate journalism sense of the word. She separated the concept of reporting, legitimate journalism from credible sources, applying actual editorial standards, from speculation generated on social media, from content created by fans, from what she specifically described as potentially bots amplifying narratives that had not been verified by anyone with actual knowledge of the internal situation. "I think legitimate news sources need to report legitimate news," she said. And in those 10 words, she drew a line that's worth paying attention to. She was not saying nothing is happening. She was not confirming everything is fine. She was saying that the information ecosystem currently generating the team division narrative does not meet the standard that she believes should be required before a story like that gets treated as fact. That is a meaningfully different statement than a flat denial, and it is the kind of answer that someone gives when they are being careful not to lie, while also not being prepared to confirm something publicly that has not been formally established. The observable facts remain. There are rumors, there is speculation. Social media has been active with narratives about the internal environment of this team. Clark won't call it journalism, the coaching staff hasn't addressed it directly, and the team keeps winning games. Make of that combination what you will. Beyond the specific moments and specific controversies of this Connecticut game, there is a body of evidence that has been accumulating all season that cuts through everything: the coaching decisions, the officiation questions, the team dynamic speculation, and makes one conclusion unavoidable. Indiana is measurably, significantly, and consistently better when Caitlin Clark is on the floor than when she is not. The plus-minus data, the measurement of how a team performs with a given player on the court versus how they perform with that player off the court, tells a story about Clark's value to this organization that is not about narrative or hot takes or which corner of basketball Twitter you prefer. It is about points scored and points allowed across hundreds of minutes of competitive basketball. The Fever win when Clark plays. They score more when Clark plays. They are more competitive in close games when Clark plays. The team that walks off the floor with a win in tight fourth-quarter situations is the team that has Clark generating plays, creating pressure, and producing the moments that competitive basketball requires. This is the context that makes the broader situation around Clark so analytically frustrating, because everything that should be optimizing her value, the offensive system, the officiation protection, the execution of teammates receiving her playmaking, is currently operating at a level below what it needs to be to fully realize what her presence on this team is worth. And despite all of that, the plus-minus still comes out overwhelmingly in her favor. She is that much better than the constraints around her. What would the numbers look like if the system were built for her? What would the win total look like if the officiation applied the same standard to her that it applies to comparable situations involving other players? What would her assist totals look like if the teammates receiving her passes converted the close-range looks she creates for them? These are not rhetorical questions with obvious answers designed to make a predetermined point. They are genuine analytical inquiries about the gap between what Clark is currently producing and what she should be producing in an environment that actually optimizes her capabilities. The answer to all of them points in the same direction. The numbers would be better, the wins would come more comfortably, the gap between Indiana and the top of the league would be smaller, and the conversation about Clark's place in the MVP discussion would be happening with even less ambiguity than it already is. Here is where everything lands when you pull back from the individual moments. The Griner hit, the missed layups, the injury designation, the social media speculation, the team division narrative that Clark refused to dignify with either a denial or a confirmation. All of it, every single piece of it, exists within a competitive picture where Indiana keeps winning and Clark keeps producing. That is the story. That is the thing that the people trying to limit her, underprotect her, and design systems that work around her instead of with her have not figured out how to solve. Because here is what the evidence of this season makes clear. The obstacles they have placed in front of her are real. The officiating inconsistency is real. The systemic constraints are real. The execution failures around her are real. And none of it is enough, not even close to enough. The question that the rest of this season will answer is not whether Clark is good enough to overcome the environment surrounding her. She has already answered that, repeatedly, with data that leaves no room for honest disagreement. The question is whether the people responsible for that environment are going to change it before the opportunity to see what Clark can do in a system actually built for her passes them by entirely. Because watching her produce masterclass performances within a framework designed to limit her is impressive. Watching what she would do without those limits, that conversation has not happened yet. And if the organization keeps making the decisions it has been making, it may never happen in Indiana. That would be the real story. And it would be a much harder one to watch.